Okay. Thank you very much. Good morning. I think I will stand up here, at least until I get tired, so I can see everybody in the back. Thanks so much, Jakob, for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here and an honor to kick off the summer school. I think this is a wonderful initiative, and I'm delighted to be a part of it. Thank you. When we first discussed this idea, Jakob asked me if I could come and say something about Hegel's idea of subjectivity. And so, I did a lot of thinking about that. There are lots of different ways in which one can do that. And I chose one of those ways concerning religion. And that might not be immediately intuitive to you. What does philosophical anthropology have to do with religion or philosophy of religion or theology? And there's, I want to suggest a couple of good answers to that. The most obvious one is that Hegel is a systematic thinker, and so to his mind, these different fields are interconnected in many different ways. But more specifically to this question, I think what I'll try to convince you of here today is that for Hegel, our conceptions of ourselves as human beings, right? This is a certain thing, and it's not a fixed thing. This changes over the course of history. Different peoples think of themselves in different ways. And the way in which one thinks of the gods is also a function of the way in which we think of ourselves as human beings. And so the idea is that in this way, right, human, divine, these are concepts which are dialectically connected, to use Hegel's language. The way in which God is conceived is a function of the way in which we think of humans, and that can mean a vast assortment of different things. And so what I thought would be an interesting thing to do would be to approach it this way. So in other words, instead of going straight to, say, those passages in Hegel's Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences where he treats philosophical anthropology, or maybe those passages at the beginning of his political philosophy, the philosophy of right, where he treats the nature of human agency. Maybe it would be more interesting, maybe we could get a clearer and a larger picture of Hegel on subjectivity if we go this way, to understand Hegel's theory of subjectivity as a parallel theory to his account of religion. And so that's what I would like to do. My talk is divided into sort of three parts. In the first, I will just try to put you in the picture as best I can, so there's no prerequisites or no knowledge assumed here. So in case you are not so familiar with Hegel's philosophy of religion, I will try to say something about that context. And then in the second part, the most important part, I will give you a thumbnail overview of Hegel's account of the different world religions. We're spending rather a lot of time here this morning, and if you start to get a little bored or find that tedious and you need an extra cup of coffee, I will understand, but I ask you to bear with me, because when we get to the third part, this is where we ask the more burning question, right? We all know of Kant's famous philosophical questions: what can I know? What ought I to do? What may I hope? And what is a human being? Kant forgot the most important question: who cares? Right? And so this is what we're going to do in the third part of the lecture. We're going to ask that non-Kantian question of who cares, why all this would be relevant to us in the 21st century. This is really interesting that Hegel said this in the 1820s. Who cares? Why is this relevant in any possible way for me? Again, I will try to suggest this is possible. This is highly relevant for our modern world, and gives us some important categories and concepts that we can use to think about the world around us. Okay, so that is the plan. I guess what I was thinking of doing would be maybe just to go through the PowerPoint for an hour, 15 minutes, something like that, and then we can take a quick coffee break or something like that, and then we will return for the who cares question. Okay, during Hegel's tenure in Berlin, which began in 1818 and continued until his death in 1831, he gave a series of lecture courses. These are some of the most famous works from him that we know. His lectures on philosophy of history, for example. One of these lecture courses was the lectures on the philosophy of religion. He gave these 4 times in different years: 1821, 24, 27, and 31. Now, in these lectures, Hegel states at the beginning, fairly straightforward, that his mission is to justify or to vindicate the truth of Christianity, right? So it sounds, okay, here's another boring Christian apologist. We've seen generations of guys like that in theology. Why is this so interesting? But what to suggest is it's not so straightforward. Why is Hegel saying that? Right? He's giving lectures at the most important thing, the university in the Kingdom of Prussia, a highly oppressive state. It's against the law in that context to criticize Christianity. It's against the law to deny any of the key Christian dogmas. So if Hegel were to stand up there and say, well, yeah, this stuff with Christianity is nonsense, or God doesn't exist, or immortality is an illusion, he would be fired and lose his job immediately. Right? So he has to be extremely careful of what he's saying here. And so, of course, he's going to say this in his first lecture. My goal is to justify Christianity, right? He's seen his colleagues suffer exactly this fate. They've lost their jobs, unceremoniously been sacked, they've been thrown into jail. He had to bail out some of his students who were jailed for protesting against the Prussian authorities. So he's seen all of this firsthand. And so when he says this initially, okay, that's what he says. We take that into account, but we have to understand the context, right? We can't take that at absolute face value. It's just as a footnote to this, it's often a cliche that one reads in the standard introductions to the history of philosophy. Hegel is a prototypical Prussian philosopher. He's writing to defend the Prussian state. This is a complete misunderstanding, a complete ahistorical piece of misinformation. Hegel himself was not from Prussia. Right? He comes from a completely different place, from what was then the Duchy of Württemberg, the city of Stuttgart. He came from a place where they had different customs, different traditions. The people in Berlin, in Prussia, they always laughed at him because he had a funny accent, right? So he didn't fit in there. He was always an outsider, right? And so he would be the last person who would have any desire to be some sort of an apologist for the Prussian state. Okay, so as I suggest, Hegel's, although his stated goal here is to defend Christianity, I think what we can, if we look at the lectures as a whole, which in the modern edition they fill like 3 quite large volumes. I mean, there's several hundred pages of text. If you just take that page for page and see what he's doing, you can see that Christianity is only a part of that, actually. But in fact, the vast number of pages, the majority of pages, is actually a treatment of the different religions of the world. Right? And so Christianity is at the end of that story, but he spends an enormous amount of time and effort in his lectures going through different accounts of the world religions, which at that time was a pretty exotic thing to do. Right? This is the time Europe is first discovering, indeed, some of these other religions, at the time of European imperialism in Asia, in Africa. And so, if you see, what Hegel's, if you see it in that light, it seems like what Hegel's really doing is something quite considerably more ambitious and actually more interesting than a straightforward apology for Christianity. But instead, what he's trying to do is to give a broader theory of what we would say mythology, or if you will, religion in general. He wants to he's basically taking as his point of departure the simple anthropological fact. Basically anything and everything has been revered as a god at some point in human history. Right? And that has resulted in just this vast number of mythologies throughout the different cultures of the world, which can seem extremely confusing, bizarre, very counterintuitive. It's very perplexing when you start to read the myths of a foreign culture. Sometimes you wonder how on earth did people come up with ideas like this. Right? And so Hegel says, right, here's his claim that, There is a logic here. There is a rationality to all of these really chaotic myths, this great diversity of stories that people tell about the gods. And it's our job as philosophers to have a hard look at that and to explain that. His basic insight is that, well, these are not just random things, these are the results of human beings, of human thought in specific places and times. And so he says if we have a feel for that historical context, then we can understand how these conceptions of the gods came about and what the nature of the myths look like. And so that's the task that he sets for himself. And again, this is closely connected to this question of subjectivity, or what we might call today individuality, or who we are as people, isn't it? Because Hegel's, the way he puts it, is this somewhat odd formulation about how human beings emerge from nature. Right? The two main categories of his entire philosophy are nature and what he calls spirit. Right? By spirit, think of something like human culture, right? Or any product of human mind, or the collective human mind. So when we're talking about art or literature, writing, religion, all of that is spirit. Right? These are all things which human beings think about and express in manifold different ways. And so as human beings make this movement from nature, right, from a time where human beings resembled the animals, resembled apes, right? That there was a long, long transition to where we're at today, right? How did that happen? How are we different from those early people, right? How is it that when we started, it was nature which was the most important thing. We were determined as physical beings. We had very, very little by way of culture. And look at the great apes. What do they have by way of culture? Not really so much, right? And however you want to define culture, right? They have very little information that gets passed on from one generation to another in a way that it accumulates, as is the case with human beings, right? But now, look at where we have arrived, right? We have computers, we have rocket ships, we have all sorts of interesting things. We have come a long way. What happened, right? How can we describe that movement? Right? And Hegel's thesis here is that this movement from nature to spirit has an important part of it is a development of subjectivity. Right? So this is our mission. What does he mean by that? Right? How is it that subjectivity has made possible all of those things and has facilitated the growth of human culture? Okay, once again, still by way of this historical background, Hegel dies in 1831, and the first edition of his lectures on the philosophy of religion was published posthumously in 1832 by this guy, a theologian named Philipp Marheinecke, who was one of Hegel's students. And so what happened after Hegel died, his students all got together, they formed a society, and they said, okay, wouldn't it be a great idea that if we were to publish all of Hegel's works in a collected works edition? And they said, well, okay, he actually only published like 4 books in his lifetime. Maybe we should supplement those books with his lectures, because those lectures were really, in some ways, extensions of his system as he wrote in the books, but he never had a chance to develop them in book form as such. His lectures in Berlin in the 1820s were extremely popular. They attracted students from all over Europe and were really the basis of some of the most important thinking that in 19th century philosophy subsequently. Think of figures such as Karl Marx, figures such as Soren Kierkegaard, figures such as Mikhail Bakunin, Engels, all people who were either directly in Hegel's lectures or were subsequently influenced by the publication of works like that appeared in the collected works editions, such as this one by Marheinecke. And so, historically speaking, this edition was extremely important, even though today we have modern editions, which are more used by scholars who I think more philologically secure than what Mark Heinecke has done. Nonetheless, the historical importance of this edition is really important because, well, this was the edition that all of these famous philosophers of the 19th century read and worked with and were responding to. We can go into that if you like, but the philological details of this are quite complex. Heinecke basically just went around to all of the students in the class and said, okay, give me your lecture notes, and then he synthesized them into a single running text. And if you imagine like somebody in this room who had that job after this lecture, you would appreciate the difficulty of that job, right? And so, yeah, so people regard this initial edition as, well, this is a little bit shaky, right? I mean, you have different impressions from many different people and then put together by the editorial judgment of a single person. And there's a lot of steps of interpretation along the way here. The more modern editions, they say, well, this is just too dubious, too questionable. And so what they've gone to doing is to publish individual lecture transcripts that were written by individual people, right? And so if they know, for example, that Bruno Bauer attended Hegel's lectures in 1827, and he wrote a full transcript of those, that's what they'll publish, right? So it's not all of those 4 lecture series mixed together through notes from all of these people through those different lectures, but it's one transcriber, one lecture, that's it. And this does have some advantages, right? And we can see how Hegel's thought developed over time, right? We can see certain nuances of it. Some people have an eye towards some things, others to other things. It should be said at the time there were also people who were basically professional note takers at the time. They would like sit in the first row, and usually working in pairs. One would write the first sentence, the next the second sentence, so they'd have a literal transcript of what was written. So some of these are extant, and they still find these things sometimes in libraries. In any case, that's what the modern editions look like. If you're really a kind of a Hegel fanatic, they're sort of interesting to look at, but if you're more of somebody who has a more general interest, they're a little bit tedious, right? Because you're basically reading the same story many different times. Okay, enough of that. The structure of Hegel's lectures. They say the modern edition, Heinecke's edition appeared in 2 volumes. The modern edition has 3 volumes, which follows Hegel's structure. It divides the material into 3 parts. If you know anything about Hegel, this is right. This is Hegel, right? Everything's about 3s. I like this, the graphic over here of Hegel. Right? The triad, this is well thought out, but Hegel would like that. So we have it starts out with the concept of religion. Here he's just asking the question, what is religion? And the idea here is, well, what our object of religion is God, right? And so religion examines the question, what is the concept of God? Right? So think of other fields, think of art, right? And what are we doing in art? We're thinking about our aesthetics, say, perhaps more specific. What is the concept of beauty in art? Or if you study, say, law or jurisprudence, what is the concept of justice, right? So there's usually some overarching concept that is governing these different fields, and then you go into the details, you find out how difficult it is to determine that. And so for Hegel, he thinks that what religion is all about is the concept of God. We talk about God all the time, right? But what do we really mean by God, right? There's this long discussion about this, and so you'll note that what's important to see here is that this is a very general discussion. It's not, I mean, we might be Christians or Hindus or Zoroastrians or atheists or whatever, but we can all use the word God and mean something by it, right? But we might have slightly different conceptions of what that is. And so then we have the discussion. And so that's what Hegel tries to do in the first part. And it's an entirely abstract ahistorical discussion. And then the second part, the determinate religion, the one that fills all those pages, this is where he looks at the specific world religions. Right? So he tries to tell the whole story. It goes back to the earliest of religions, the very first time the human mind conceived of the idea of a divinity, a God, right? And goes all the way through to modern religions. And so here, it's, in some ways you can see it as exactly the opposite, right? But the first discussion was, well, what do we mean by God in general, right? Without any historical context. Here, right, what do the specific historical religions mean when they say God, right? How did the Egyptians conceive of their gods? How did the Greeks conceive of their gods? So it's something very specific, very particular. And so Hegel also likes to use these categories from logic or metaphysics. So the one that's asking about the universal, give me the universal definition, the one that applies in all cases. And here we're looking at the individual particular definitions. For the Greeks, God looks like this. For the Persians, God looks like that, right? All very different. And then the third section he calls the absolute religion. This is where he treats Christianity. And his idea here is that this is where we finally find the one particular religion that corresponds to the true concept. And this is the Christian religion, he thinks. He has lots of reasons to think that. He believes, which we will have a chance to go into. And not just the fact that he's trying to appease the Prussian authorities and keep his job. This is always in the background, of course. But I mean, he is truly a Lutheran Christian. He truly believes that this is in some way correct. And this is an important point here. If he's going to make this claim, okay, Christianity is of all of those religions I just went through here in several hundred pages, right? We end up with Christianity. It's like a teleology. It leads up to this culminating point, Christianity, and this is the true one. Well, it's a little bit difficult in our day and age to stand up and say that sort of thing. I mean, we might well be believing Christians, but it sounds a little bit dismissive or condescending, right, in a way. Okay, I'm just going to throw out all those other religions. They're completely meaningless or superstitious or whatever. And so, but this is a strong claim, right? Christianity, there's something about Christianity that captures the truth of the concept of religion, the concept of God. This is the true concept of God. And then the pendant to this is that there's also something about the conception of Christianity that makes it possible for us to be subjective and free individuals. And this is also the important point for our general concept here for the summer school is, all right, what is he saying here? I mean, is he saying throughout all of the development of human history that people have not been free before, right? That they haven't had any sense of subjectivity or individuality before, but it was only with Christianity that this becomes fully realized. Yes, that's what he's saying. In a way, it's not intuitive, right? We think that, okay, we have generally today a certain understanding of what it is to be free. I am a free agent. I am in control of my agency. I make a certain plan. I go out on that day, and I do it, right? People in the past, they probably got more or less the same thing, right? Hegel's saying, no, your intuitions here are wrong, right? If you look at things historically, things look completely different. People didn't have that conception of agency, and because of that, their understanding of the gods looked completely different. A complex set of topics, right? The gods on the one hand, and how you think of yourself and your own freedom and agency on the other. This is very complex. This is why I think it's important for us to spend a little time here on the story he wants to tell about the difference in the world religions, to see how he thinks this development has taken place. And it should also be said that if you look at the secondary literature on this, which is pretty big, there's not so much material on the middle section, actually. There's maybe one or two books, rather short ones, that treat this material, but most of the secondary literature is focused on this, right? So this is, of course, if you're a theologian, that's the most important. What does Hegel have to say about Christianity? What does he say about the Christian dogmas? And so that's fine if you're a theologian, but it misses the point a little bit, I submit. We have this very elaborate story that Hegel's telling, indeed a systematic story. He really thinks that these different parts are each playing a specific role. You can't just take one out and hope to understand it, right? And so if we say, all right, let's just focus on what he has to say about Christianity, you're missing the point a little bit, right? For him, the whole point about the truth of Christianity is, well, how did we get here, right? How is it that the conception of ourselves and of the Christian God arrived at that conception? How is this the result of a long, long history of development of religious thinking? And so I submit the better approach is to try to understand these lectures, understand Hegel's thought here in the way in which he presented them, the way in which he thought they fit together himself. And this means we can't really spare ourselves the hard work of going through his account of the determinate religions, even though some of that material might seem a little bit foreign to us, even a little bit tedious. It's a lot of work. Let me just give you some feel for that with his organization of the lectures themselves. I mean, this is complex stuff, and this is the simplified version. If you look at how this develops from one lecture to the next, some of these change a little bit. Right? So he has the basic division is the religions of nature and the religions of spirit. The religions of nature, these are all of the religions which take an object of nature to be the divine. So if you take, say, a plant, an animal, and you revere them as divinities, you're a religion of nature. Or a river, a mountain, a star, the sun, right? These are objects of nature which many peoples indeed venerated as gods, right? And so Hegel says that's the first, this is how religion got started. This was the beginning of it. Human beings were in a state of nature, if you will. They felt very small in that context. You're out there, victim of the elements, right? And you look around, you are in awe of nature. It makes sense. There are many forces in nature which are much more powerful than you. So it's only a short step from there to unconceiving of those objects of nature as deities, as gods. By contrast, he has the religions of spirit, which he takes to be the more advanced account. And the religions of spirit, these are any kind of religious thinking which conceives of the gods or the goddesses in a anthropomorphic form. So they're like human beings. They are self-conscious entities. The most obvious, so you think of the Greek or the Roman gods, for example, right? Zeus, Apollo, right? They're very much like humans. They're just immortal and they're much more powerful, right? But they do many of the same sorts of things that human beings do. And so, you can see here that he's really trying here as best he can. Today, you would do this in a much more different fashion if you were a modern student of, say, history of religion or cultural anthropology. But today, but think of Hegel's situation, right? He's sitting there in Berlin in the 1820s. The amount of information he has, especially about some of these religions, it's a little bit rudimentary. Europe is just learning about this, right? For example, with Hinduism, this is the generation in which, due to the British India, right, some of the British administrators there are starting to learn the languages and to translate that material into European language, into English for the first time. This is causing a huge sensation. People are loving it, right? Think of Egyptian religion, right? Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, right, at the end of the 18th century. This is the beginning of Egyptology as a scholarly field, right? Before this, people didn't really know much, right? There was just a few odd accounts of, certain travelers who saw this or that or whatever. They had, of course, the ancient accounts of Herodotus, but not so much. It was really sort of scattershot information. In Hegel's time, this was the first time that Europe was really getting meaningful information about this material and starting to study it in a scholarly fashion. Hegel was among the first generation of people to do this. If you're interested in German idealism in general, it's just sort of an important thing. I mean, I've worked in German idealism all my life. Right? I was really shocked and surprised to see the importance of this dimension, which I had never seen before. I mean, you think of somebody like Kant or Hegel, Schelling. This is not the first thing you think of when you think of the works of these guys. But actually, if you go back, you see that they're all extremely attentive to this. They're really aware that this is a new cultural movement that's going on at the time. And they really are doing their best to try to take this into account. Some maybe better than others. And here you can see really Hegel, he's making an effort, right? I mean, he's really gone out of his way to familiarize himself with an enormous amount of what was then very new information. Okay, let me go ahead and just in the interest of time skip over a couple of these things. This gets us back to maybe why people have not been so interested in this dimension of Hegel's philosophy before. We have, I don't know how many different books on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit or on his philosophy of right, almost nothing on this element of Hegel's thought, his account of the world religions. Well, why is that the case? Well, it's a tough research area, right? You can't just sit there and read Hegel's own text and then draw conclusions from it. It really requires you to know something about the different religions that he's talking about. And if you're have this kind of training I do, you're not usually trained to have an intimate familiarity with, say, Hinduism or these religions of ancient China, which Hegel's talking about. And so you need to, one needs to have some familiarity with this. And this is like what I regard as an ongoing educational project for myself. It's really interesting stuff. I've enjoyed doing it, but one always feels a little bit inadequate when approaching it. The other dimension of this is that people think, okay, here's Hegel working in the 1820s with these older materials. I mean, how good was that stuff he was working with, really? I mean, isn't this stuff full of Eurocentric prejudice and so colonial imperialist nonsense? It's true, it is, in part. Not always. But that dimension is there. If you read it with our modern sensibilities, of course, you're going to find that sort of thing there. And one can also find that sort of thing in Hegel himself, especially when he's talking about the earlier you go back, the more condescending he is. I guess that's the way to put it. He's quite critical of the ancient Chinese and of the Hindus. He's a little more forgiving when you get up to Zoroastrianism, right, the religion of the Persians and with the Egyptians. But there's certainly, you wouldn't have to work too hard to find lines there which are offensive or distasteful to our modern sensibilities. There are lines there which are racist. I mean, sad to say, this is true. And this is, of course, this is a problem for the research. And this has, in itself, spawned an important body of secondary literature. And I think this is an important thing. And we're critical thinking philosophy students, right? We should be critical of this sort of thing, right? And there's no reason just to say, well, Hegel was a great thinker, so let's just forget that element. No, you can't forget it. You have to have a hard look at that and evaluate it for what it is. And I think that this has been a problem. That in the research literature, people haven't really known how to deal with it very well, frankly. I mean, that they feel like, okay, this is just so problematic, so offensive to our modern sensibilities. Let's just forget the whole thing, right? Do some work on his logic or something else. Right? Or you can go the other way and say, let's just focus on this thing. Okay, Hegel was a racist, right? And I can write a book about that, right? But okay, in a certain sense. But the approach I've tried to take is somewhere in the middle. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to ignore that side of it. I mean, but when we acknowledge it, it doesn't mean, it's a non sequitur to say with that, Hegel doesn't have anything interesting or meaningful to say about religion. Right? He can also, he can have certain prejudicial, ethnocentric views on his own account, but that doesn't undermine everything else he's saying. And so what I've tried to do in my research is to acknowledge the objection, but then to see what insights he has otherwise with regard to the development of world religions, and then just present that and discuss that, right? And if we find something that's objectionable, fine, let's criticize it and move on, but let's not make that stand in the way of us approaching the material at all, because it clearly was very important for Hegel himself. Okay. This goes hand in hand with the question of Hegel's teleology, which people find really difficult to deal with. All right, they have this conception that the world religions lead up to Christianity. There's sort of a necessary course that we're tracing here, and that Christianity is the highest religion. This is true. This is what he says, but it's not to say, right, that all of that other material that came before is meaningless, right? We just look at that overview of the material that I showed you. Right? If he just wanted to celebrate Christianity at the end, why would he need to go through all those hundreds of pages and look at in such great detail at all those other world religions? I mean, that's clearly not the point, right? The idea is that we're supposed to understand this as a whole, as a developing whole. And so he's not exclusivist about this. I guess that's what I want to say. And this comes out very clearly in the lectures himself, where at the beginning of his lectures, he tries to address exactly these sorts of prejudices, right? So imagine him in Berlin in the 1820s, and he's like me, standing up in front of a group of students, and he's aware that at that time, there's going to be some people who think, well, why are we wasting our time, talking about the religion of like Hinduism or Zoroastrianism? This just seems like silly, superstitious nonsense, right? But what does Hegel say? He reproaches those people, right? Says, wait, think about this again, right? It's not that simple. It's undoubtedly true that the definite religions of the various peoples often enough exhibit the most distorted, confused, and abortive ideas of the divine being, and likewise of duties and relations as expressed in worship. Right? So if you just stop there and say, okay, the guy's a racist, he's an ethnocentric person, but, he continues, we must not treat the matter so lightly and conceive of it in a superficial manner as to reject these ideas and these rites as superstition, error, and deceit. On the contrary, something higher is necessary, namely to recognize the meaning, the truth, and the connection with the truth. In short, to get to know what is rational in them. There are human beings who hit upon such religions, therefore there must be reason in them, and amidst all that is accidental in them, a higher necessity. And so there he's approaching these sorts of people and saying, no, we have to look at this. It might look crazy and superstition or irrational, but that's just because you don't know anything about it, right? We're supposed to be philosophers. What's our goal as philosophers? To understand the world around us. Well, let's use our rationality and try to do that. And if we use the right approach, we can discern that rationality, right? And so this is everything but a dismissive and critical pro-European view. On the contrary, this is a statement where he's trying to promote interest in this, in what was then at the time quite new fields of study. And so these are some of the general theses that I wanted to suggest to why this material is important and worth taking seriously. First, the historical dimension is the key to understanding religion generally and Christianity specifically. So as I was mentioning before, people who just want to take his account of Christianity and focus just on that, they're missing the point a little bit, right? We need an account of what is leading up to that in order to understand Christianity. What else? The key claim that we want to spend a bit more time on, that for Hegel, the conception of the divine is necessarily related to the conception of a people and of the individual. And then we have a quotation from the lectures: the finite religions are the appearance in history of these moments. That is, the concept of the divine. Momency just means aspects or stages. In order to grasp these in their truth, it's necessary to consider them under two aspects. On the one hand, we have to consider how God is known, how he is characterized, and on the other, how the subject at the same time knows itself. Right? So here you see Hegel, the dialectical thinker. Like the one is the concept of God. How does a specific religion conceive of, think of God? But that's not all that it is, right? We have to see how those peoples of the world, how the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, and the Persians, how they thought of themselves, right? These two things are necessarily connected for Hegel. He takes to be a new insight. And as I was mentioning, the importance of this for Hegel is also completely under-recognized in the research literature. Sometimes people think of Schopenhauer as the first person in German philosophy to be interested in Asian religions, right? Because he was quite interested in his theory was quite inspired by accounts of Buddhism or Hinduism. He was quite well read in some of these then new translations of the materials coming out of India at the time, and really was trying to use it in a very positive way. And it's also Nietzsche is sometimes cast in this role because of his use of Zarathustra, of course, referring to Zoroastrianism. Right? Although what Nietzsche does with this is a little bit more creative thinking than it is actually historical studies, but nonetheless, there is an acknowledgement there of different religious traditions beyond Christianity. And I think that for reasons I was just talking about, this is a topic that's really still very much with us today. There are still people who are very interested in the role of different cultures. And here we live in a globalized world. Right? We have students here from all over the place. Right? We live in multicultural societies. We know people from different religions. Right? This all looked very different in Berlin in the 1820s. But Hegel could sort of see the beginnings of that even then. And these discussions that he's in with his colleagues at the time about the role and the status of this new material is the forerunner of discussions that are still going on today. Right? Which in Hegel's time, the big question was, well, we've had this long tradition in the university for classical philology, and that meant Greek and Latin, basically, which was really the key to the humanities curriculum in his day. Then suddenly, they discover all this new material that comes from completely different traditions, right? And what do we do with this, right? So this was really a dilemma in Hegel's time, and sort of a political question as well, right? Should we acknowledge this as meaningful and important material? Should we dedicate new departments for this stuff? Or should we just say, oh, this is silly nonsense and not relevant? And so in Hegel's time, the first Lehrstuhl for Indology was created at the University of Berlin. Right? This the first time people were beginning to learn how to read Sanskrit and to translate that material. And so this tells you that this is the beginnings of the fields that we know today as Asian studies, right? And these are discussions that are still going on today about what is the status of that material, what is the relationship of that material to what we understand. It's like the Western classics. Is it of the same value? Is it of an inferior value? Is it even make sense to make comparisons of this sort? And these are ongoing questions. And so, here again, Hegel has some insight for us. What else can we say? Yes, Hegel's account of subjectivity. Perhaps, if you know anything at all about Hegel, you probably know something about the master and slave dialectic from the phenomenology of spirit. This is, in some ways, his point of departure for understanding human relationships. what does, we remember from that account that he gives, what is it to be a human being, to be a self-conscious entity? How is it that we're different from rocks and trees and things like that? This is the key concept of recognition, right? When I look at a table, right, the table is not looking back at me, right? But when I look at you, right, I can see in your eyes, you're looking back at me, like all these eyes on me. Right? What's happening in that dynamic, right? I mean, we do this a million times a day. We never even think about it. Hegel's saying that what's happening is that I can see myself in your eyes, right? That I'm, in a certain sense, being reflected back to myself. This is his language, right? Through the fact that you are here and you are looking at me, right? And so it has almost like a spatial metaphor. But first, I am here, and then I'm going out of myself, and then through this look of the other, I'm returning to myself. Right? And so there is a certain conception that I have of myself, which is always conditioned by that return. Right? So when I look at you, I'm imagining, what are all these people thinking, right? Is my jacket on right? Is my hair looking okay, right? You get very self-conscious if you do this for too long, right? But again, we do this all the time. Why do we look in the mirror before we leave our home? Well, we want to make sure we're looking okay, right? Because other people are going to be looking at us, right? Better that I look at myself first, right? His point here is that this is an important dynamic of what it is to be human in a development of our subjectivity and our consciousness, right? And that there's no substitute for it, right? If we're living alone on an island or something with no other human beings, we're just surrounded by nature. We're not in this sort of a dynamic, right? We don't have recognition of another human being. This is why our interaction with others is so fundamentally important. This is why we live in families and in societies, right? We are in constant interaction with other people. It forms a fundamental part of who we are as people, as individuals. Right? There's this modern mythos of the self-made individual, right? As if I'm just some atom alone in the world somewhere. No, we're always together with other people, always in interaction with other people, and that fundamentally shapes who we are, how we think of ourselves, right? Sometimes just search your own experience about this. Sometimes you can have a bad day just because somebody gave you a dirty look, right? Well, what's happening there, right? What's returning back to you, that's not the way you think of yourself, right? Somebody said something unpleasant to you, right? We're very worried about these things, right? We don't want people to have opinions of ourselves which are radically different from the opinions we have of ourselves, right? We want them to think the same things about us that we think about us. And so there's this constant negotiation going on about my self-conception, about the conceptions that other people have of themselves and me, right? This works always in both directions, of course. I want you to recognize me as being a certain person, and vice versa, right? And Hegel, his point is that this is an important insight also for religion, right? Because if we're doing this collectively as human beings all the time, we're developing societies historically. In the course of time, human beings, they also come to think of themselves collectively as groups. Who are we as whatever, members of the European Union, as Czechs, as whatever you come from, whatever your nationality is, whatever group you identify with. What does that mean, right? What does that stand for? Right? This is also something that we are constantly checking and reaffirming with one another all the time, especially like during political campaigns, right? This is the kind of thing that politicians like to beat their fists on the table about. What do we stand for? What are our basic principles? What are we as a people? This is it, right? And Hegel thinks, well, it's those conceptions that are leading us in the direction of why it's important to think about our relationship to God, right? The gods. Is the way in which people conceive of themselves collectively as a group. This is going to be a reflection of the kind of gods that they have, right? If you conceive of yourselves as a terrible, sinful person, right? You will conceive of your God as somebody who has very little patience for sin, right? It's a natural relation, right? If you conceive of yourself as a slave, well, what is the pendant to the slave? A master, right? You're going to need somebody else. And so this creates this sorts of constellations of relationships that Hegel thinks that are quite insightful for how we understand God and the divine historically. Okay, and here we have some of the material that we were talking about before. Maybe we can make this go through this a little bit quicker about the relationship of history and religion. We know from Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history, which he gave some parallel to his lectures on the philosophy of religion, he's telling very much the same kind of a story, actually. He's telling how human beings emerged from nature and how they developed up until the point when he was writing these lectures in the 1820s. Then it's a long story. If you have read Hegel's introduction to those lectures, you know that his thesis is that this is the story of the development of human freedom. How it is that humans are, in a certain sense, becoming more free through the development of history. So again, this is his claim that human beings in the past were not free. They had not really fully realized the human potential, whereas when you get into his period, this is the case that people have understood their own subjectivity, as a way of putting it, and understood their own freedom. And so, in that sense, in those lectures, he's not interested in religion primarily, but the story he's telling is absolutely parallel. Right? We have a story of different world historical peoples, which are organized. He organizes them as in a single sequence. Right? You have the Chinese and India, and then you have Persia and Egypt and Greece and so forth. And he takes these as individual peoples, and he tries to define what is their specific worldview, what is their conception of their agency, and that leads him up to the modern world. We see exactly the same story in the lectures on the philosophy of religion, only told through, instead of the accounts of the different peoples, rather the accounts of their gods, right? And so that while he's looking at world historical peoples in the lectures on the philosophy of history, he's looking at world historical religions in the history, the philosophy of religion lectures. But the story, the narrative he's telling, the fundamental upshot of it is about the development of human subjectivity and freedom. I'm asking myself, is this the time to take the break?
I think so.
Okay.
Looks like it.
Well, let's have a cup of coffee.
10 minutes. Okay, 10 minutes.